Oh, there we go. So just as an overview, the philosophical roots of phenomenology is something we're going to look at, and the principles and methods of IPA. So when we think about phenomenology, it's this experience, this lived experience, or this phenomenon. And in the context of this research, it's the experience of being shunned when leaving the Jehovah's Witness religion. And obviously this doesn't occur just in the Jehovah's Witnesses. This can occur in other high control, strict religions and other situations in life. But that lived experience, I was investigating or exploring its effects on people's identity and their self-esteem and their belonging and their mental well-being. So I did that using IPA, which is hermeneutics, which basically just means meaning making, the same as in narrative analysis. So it's how I, as a researcher, interpreted the stories that were told to me by former Jehovah's Witnesses. And in a sense, again, as I've said before, it's this double hermeneutic, this co-constructed story. So we're all trying to we're all trying to understand each other. And it's this ideographic approach, so how a researcher focuses on each individual participant by a case-by-case approach. So each participant is as important as the last. We're not trying to make anybody fit into a mold here. Okay, so here's where we get into like the nitty-gritty of it a little bit. So extracting the codes and identifying themes, which is identifying of IPA, where we're looking for these themes that emerge from the data. So the first theme that emerged a lot was this on identity, which often involved almost like an identity crisis. So if we just go through some of these quotes, I'll then explain how it was obvious that there was some mediating factors going on. So Sue, she said, I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know how to do life as a non-Jehovah's Witness. And Claire, you really don't know who you are as a person because you've been conditioned to think a certain way. And Joanne, you identify because you have friends and you've been taught to have these friends only who all have the same view and opinion as you. And I was completely on my own. I couldn't identify. I was ostracized, kicked out of the group. So these last two quotes now from John and Sophie were slightly different. John said it was a cage of self-imprisonment, which was restrictive on your identity. So he was reflecting back then, but I don't identify with it now. And Sophie, who converted to the Jehovah's Witnesses when she was in her 20s, when asked about her identity, she commented that I think it depends whether or not you were indoctrinated in your former years. So here I started to see that there were mediating factors in people's experience of how they dealt with their identity post-exit. And those three factors were control, childhood indoctrination, and belief. So thinking firstly about control, there's actually two ways to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses. You can leave voluntarily, or you can be what's called disfellowshipped. I don't know if any of you have heard of that term. But being disfellowshipped is like a forced exit from the Jehovah's Witnesses. So you've committed some kind of sin and been warranted as unrepentant, and so you are disfellowshipped, and that results in like this immediate mandated shunning from the Jehovah's Witness community, including your family. So hopefully you'll be able to see there that there's a big difference between leaving something voluntarily and being kicked out, so to speak. It's a bit like maybe getting fired from your job as opposed to leaving and getting another job. So that's going to make a big difference to how you feel about yourself. It could give you feelings of guilt or shame or something like that. So that was the first thing that I noticed, that this idea of control, that people who were disfellowshipped seemed to have more what I would call like an identity crisis. And that was based not only on the fact that they were disfellowshipped, but also because they've been born and raised in the religion. So the effect of childhood indoctrination was quite deep, because I suppose with people that have been converted into the Jehovah's Witnesses as adults, they've already had an identity formation throughout their childhood and adolescence, and that's kind of formed. Whereas when you're born and raised in the Jehovah's Witnesses, it's very identity forming. So you've got nothing to revert back to because it's all you've ever known. And it's not just your personal identity, it's also your social identity, because Jehovah's Witnesses, and I too was brought up this way, you're taught to only have friends who are also Jehovah's Witnesses. So if you leave, not only do you lose your personal identity, you can also lose your social identity. So you can be in this position where you literally have no one. So that's very, very isolating. So I'm hoping that you can see there the difference between control and childhood indoctrination. And also that leads on to the third factor, which was belief. So it came out in the data that those who were disfellowshipped, they still believed the doctrine. And if you know anything about the doctrine of Jehovah's Witnesses and other similar religions, it's what we could call maybe a doomsday eschatology. So their belief is that Armageddon, which is, you know, God's war against wickedness, is due any day now. So it's you've got this idea that the world's going to end tomorrow. It hasn't, and this idea has been proclaimed for many decades now. But if you are a Jehovah's Witness who still believes that we're on Armageddon's door, so to speak, and you're disfellowshipped, then it's almost like not being in the ark. You know, when you think about Noah's Ark, only those in the ark survived. So they often use the illustration that if you leave the Jehovah's Witnesses, then you're not in the ark anymore. And so when Armageddon comes, basically you're going to die. So these three factors, control, childhood indoctrination and belief, seem to have a huge bearing on people's coping mechanisms with their identity. But it wasn't just their identity, it was their mental health as well. So this slide here talks about the theme of depersonalization and also obedience. So this is where the idea of mental health seemed to arise a lot in most of the transcripts. So just looking at a few of the quotes here. It was like I'd been hit with a sledgehammer. I twice took an overdose. That was Sue. It was a very, very black time in my life, the suicide of my son after he was disfellowshipped. Now, Claire's story was especially tragic because she herself had been disfellowshipped twice, but also because of this idea of childhood socialization and belief. She believed that it was the only true religion, and so she raised her children in it, which gave her a lot of guilt because when her son was disfellowshipped, he couldn't cope with the loss of his social identity and this idea of Armageddon being imminent and, you know, being on almost like a death row mentality. And so he committed suicide, which obviously was a very life-defining moment for Claire, and quite an emotional moment for both of us during the interview. Then Sue said, I wished I wasn't breathing because then I wouldn't feel the pain. It was like every part of my body had a pin stuck in it. Now, this was really interesting because I don't know if you know anything about the psychological literature, but some fMRI studies have been done on the difference between social pain and physical pain. So using like manipulated ostracism, people have had their brain activity measured using fMRI, and it's been found that the same area of the brain lights up with social pain as it does with physical pain. So it helps us to understand there why people say, you know, if you're being ignored, that it feels painful, because it's the same area of the brain. So it does feel painful. And in the cases of these participants, this was not just short-term ostracism. In some cases, this is ostracism that's been going on for 25 and 30 years. So we had a few metaphors as well. Joanne here said, it's like being in the film I Am Legend. It's like the whole world has died. They are your whole world. You don't associate with anyone else. I was on my own in the world, but they were alive, living their lives without me. So this and a few other metaphors spoke about Joanna also talked about being a survivor of a plane crash. She said it's like being on a plane with all your friends and family and it crashes and you're the only survivor. And interestingly, Sue also said, and these were not connected, said it was like all of her friends and family had gone down in a jumbo jet over the Atlantic. So we can see this recurring theme of like this depersonalization, this being separate from reality, that had really quite severe effects to mental health. And then Claire said you're made to feel repugnant, you're a dog returning to its vomit. So how can you feel worthy in any way? So that's how she felt about the effects of being disfellowshipped, made to feel sinful, I suppose, and then having everybody ignore you would you know, elucidate these feelings of guilt and shame. Now, Sophie, she was in a domestic violence situation, and that was why she was disfellowshipped, because she told people about it, and they didn't like that. So she became so unstable that she was hospitalized, and she was told that she was suffering with this reactive psychosis because she was reacting so badly, you know, to the injustice. So instead of being the victim, she became disfellowshipped herself. So that caused awful mental health effects to her. Okay, so this slide here is talking about social support. So this is a little bit more encouraging. So what we found was, well, I'll just read these first. So Claire said, I've become involved with a group of people that have experienced some of the things I've experienced, and I found that greatly helpful. And being able to talk to other people who can relate to your experience, I can't express enough how much that has helped me, really. So she's talking there about ex-Jehovah's Witness Facebook group, which is where I actually asked for participants, and that's how I got hold of Claire in the first place. But she found after 30 years of struggling with her mental health that joining a support group, especially set up for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, has really helped her. Similarly, John, he said, I've made friends, I've been to university and I've met tons of people. I've joined committees and I'm quite an influential person now. And then Sue, conversely, said there was no social media, so there was nobody to talk to. So that was extremely isolating. And I think that was one of the hardest things. There wasn't an ex-Jehovah's Witness support group. So this is the kind of thing that I'm looking at for future research, because meeting new friends outside the group and building a new social identity seem to be crucial to people's recovery, not just of their identity and their self-esteem, but their mental health as well. Now, even in this way, sometimes this can be a challenge for former Jehovah's Witnesses, and they would avoid joining, especially ex-Jehovah's Witness groups, because of the stigma that they are used to having with that. So as Jehovah's Witnesses, we were taught not to have anything to do with former Jehovah's Witnesses. They were called apostates. And so you have to try and get over that stigma of belonging to an ex-Jehovah's Witness support group. So it's a challenge to break out of that mentality. Okay, so this is the last slide now. So hopefully you've been able to see that IPA, very similar to narrative analysis, is a suitable methodology for sensitive research such as this. And it's why it's better than, well, I can't say better, can I? Different to quantitative measures. So the reference at the bottom there, Life After Social Death, that was the first study of my PhD. So that's now been published as well. So if you wanted to see the difference between quantitative research and qualitative research in this area, we can see that it's only qualitative work that captures that the real world experiences and the contextual data that you just can't capture with numbers. So my next work is hoping to show the longitudinal implications to identity reformulation. So I'm hoping to, well, I've already done it, to interview people or to re-interview them to see what progress has been made you know, in terms of transitioning their identity from a Jehovah's Witness to an ex-Jehovah's Witness. And I'm hoping to use narrative analysis for this. And also, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm hoping to explore domestic and childhood sexual abuse found in former Jehovah's Witnesses too, because this was quite a disturbing theme that came up. And I only interviewed, I think it was 26 people, but the incidence of domestic abuse and childhood abuse was actually quite high. So although I think that's going to be quite a traumatic thing to do, I'm hoping to explore that also in my next paper. And I think that's it. So I'm going to try and unshare this. Okay, let me see if I can find where you all are. There. Okay, have I unshared my screen? Stop sharing options. There we go.
That's
okay. I've unshared it. I hope it's gone.
Thank you so much, Heather. I think I'm echoing somewhere. Quite disconcerting, isn't it?
Is it doing that echoing thing?
Yeah. Let's see if we can discuss that. Just a second. I'm just